Do you put tiny little solar panels all over your Christmas tree? Maybe yes, maybe no. Let's find out what you think. Come with me. By the way, I've hidden this picture of a goat somewhere in the video. See if you can find it. If it was Christmas for you recently, then that means you probably went and found an outside toy like this, or maybe this funky looking guy who just needs some love, then brought it inside like this, or maybe you have a pretend one in a box like this. Either way, gave it some pretty clothes like this, then made it do this. Whoa, what's that? That's a light, but what kind of light? Because there's more than one kind. Well, this kind right here is an LED, which won't give you lead poison. LEDs are the most common type of light source manufactured and used today. And not just for Christmas lights. They're also used for home lighting, headlights, and even screens. But what the heck actually is an LED? Well, it's helpful to know what it stands for, which is light emitting diode. And I'm pretty sure I know what light emitting means because that's how we got here. But diode... Let's talk diodes. To put it simply, a diode is something that is intended to allow electricity to flow one way, but not the other. And there are like a bajillion different kinds of diodes, and most of them don't emit light. And I actually want to start by talking about one that does not emit light because it's like an entry-level diode. The type that I want to talk about involves something called the PN junction, which is not scary, we will go through it. Basically, it involves a P-type material meeting an N-type material. And in this baby's first diode, what are the P-type and N-type materials made out of? Well, those two materials are silicon and silicon. It's just seasoned differently on both sides. To understand what makes a P-type silicon different from an N-type silicon, it's helpful to know what's going on in pure silicon in the first place. So we're going to Silicon Valley, baby. As you can see in this very clear diagram, silicon has 4 electrons in its outer layer, but it wants to have 8. In a pure silicon sample, what the atoms do is when they get close to each other, they kind of share electrons, and then they all get to pretend like they have more than they really do. And this isn't really going to work with paper. So all of the silicon atoms will come together, and each silicon atom is now connected to 4 others, and they all share, and everybody gets to pretend like they have 8 electrons. Then you might think, well, now the electrons are all where they want to be, no one has to go anywhere, right? Wrong. This part actually really surprised me to learn about, because what will happen is even though everything looks fine on paper, an electron will just up and wander off. When this happens, you end up with what's called a free electron, and it leaves behind this kind of gap where an electron should be, and that's called a hole. In a pure silicon sample, this is happening all the time. There are free electrons and holes all over the place. An electron can pop out and then pop back into a hole, but the number of free electrons is the same as the number of holes, and so it all kind of balances itself out. Now, this is where things get really interesting, so bust out the handy-dandy notebook, sit in your thinking chair, and take some notes. What we've got to do now is we need to make a P-type silicon and an N-type silicon, and that's done by adding things to it. We're going to start by adding phosphorus. The thing about phosphorus is that it has 5 electrons in its outer layer. By comparison to silicon, it has an extra electron to give up. This results in more of the holes being filled and a larger number of free electrons just floating around. Electrons have a negative charge. That makes this overall a more negative sample. Call it an N-type silicon. On the other side, let's add some boron. Boron only has 3 electrons in its outer layer, so by comparison to silicon, it has fewer to give up. It gobbles up more of the free electrons, leaving behind more holes. The holes are considered to have a positive charge, so overall this boron-filled sample is called a positive or P-type silicon sample. So now you have a P-type and an N-type silicon, and you squash them together and you end up with a PN junction. Naturally, what's going to happen is that some of the free electrons from the N-type silicon are going to want to hop across into the P-type silicon to fill the holes. Now, what happens here is far too complicated to get in depth in this video. I don't even fully understand it. It's kind of like everybody's playing for the other team for a second in the middle. What you end up with is something called the depletion zone, which basically prevents this flow from happening on a continuous basis. But now, let's hook the whole thing up to a power source. When it's hooked up the way that it wants, we're going to be adding more electrons into the N side, which will shrink the depletion zone and allow for a continuous flow of electrons from the N side into the P side. And when the electrons land on the P side, they fill the holes. When you hook it up the way that it doesn't like to go, basically just think that the depletion zone grows to the point that nothing flows across the PN junction. except in cases where you've given it too much power and the whole thing breaks. This concept is called forward biasing versus reverse biasing, and to try and make it clear, I asked ChatGPT to draw an image that would define it, and like, here's the image. Back to the idea of the electrons jumping from the N side into the P side. What you need to know is that it takes energy for an electron to become a free electron just floating around by itself. And when it lands in one of those holes, its energy level drops. It releases energy. In this silicon-based diode that's been doped with phosphorus on one side and boron on the other, this energy is primarily released in just the form of heat. These diodes just warm up a little bit. In theory, if the energy drop that electron experienced was greater, it would actually emit energy in the form of visible light. The material properties of silicon, phosphorus, boron, it doesn't produce a significant enough energy drop, and it just won't produce visible light. That's where other materials come into play. To make a diode that emits light, in other words, a light-emitting diode, or LED, use more complicated materials that actually encourage the proper energy drop that releases visible light. I've put the table on the screen. You can pause the video if you want to have a look at what those materials are and what colors of light they emit. And even though those diodes and PN junctions and everything involve much more complicated materials, the physics and the concepts behind what is going on is exactly the same as the silicon phosphorus boron diode example. But sticking with that silicon diode, it may not emit light, but it does something special with light. Let's think of the whole thing backwards for a sec. Instead of emitting energy, now we're going to be thinking about putting energy into that system. We'll put energy in the system in the form of light from the sun. When light energy enters this system, it's possible for it to knock an electron out of the P side into the N side, and this will cause a flow of electricity that can power machinery. That's a solar panel. And so a solar panel operates essentially on the exact same physics principles as an LED, but somewhat in reverse. Now, does that mean that a solar panel and an LED are really the same device being played backwards from each other? Not entirely. They are designed to do different things. They do make use of different materials because of the specific properties that they're looking for. It's very much the same thing as saying that walking up the stairs isn't really just walking down the stairs in reverse. Unless, of course, this is just how you roll, which I personally don't recommend. So, do you put solar panels all over your Christmas tree? Probably not. I don't think that I do. But an LED and a solar panel operate on basically the exact same physics principles. They're just designed to do different things. That's all I've got. Thanks for watching.